Imagine this. A woman walks into an ancient Greek courtroom, not wearing her finest silks, not draped in modesty, but entirely naked. The crowd gasps, the judges choke on their moral superiority, and somewhere the gods probably high-five each other. This wasn't just scandal, it was strategy. Her name was Phryne, a courtesan so beautiful she could bankrupt philosophers, break laws, and make Athens itself blush. But what she did that day, it wasn't just about survival, it was about rewriting the rules of shame, power, and performance. Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, birthplace of philosophy, and home of the most passive-aggressive citizens to ever argue about ethics over cheap wine. It's the 4th century BCE, and the city hums like a drunken lyre string. Politics, poetry, and perfume all tangled together. The streets are marble by day, but by night, they're a performance stage where reputation and rumor dance like drunk actors who forgot their lines. You can almost smell it. Olive oil, incense, and the faint aroma of hypocrisy. Men strut through the agora debating justice and moderation while simultaneously buying slaves, visiting brothels, and pretending their wives don't exist after sunset. The philosophers write treatises about virtue, but let's be honest, half of them would sell their scrolls for 5 minutes in the company of a hetaira. Now, if you're wondering what that is, let's clarify. The hetaira weren't your average sex workers. No, these women were trained in music, wit, and the fine art of making a man think he was interesting. They were educated, sophisticated, and dangerous in a city that feared clever women almost as much as it feared Persian invasions. Think of them as a mix between a supermodel, a therapist, and a political lobbyist, but with better eyeliner. They attended the symposia, drinking parties where the so-called intellectual elite sprawled on couches and tried to outdo each other in philosophy and poor decision-making. The hetaira could enter these male-only spaces because they weren't respectable women, and in a twisted irony that gave them freedom the respectable ones could never touch. And it's in this city, this glittering hypocrisy, that a girl named Phryne first arrives. She's from Thespii, a small town famous for its sculptors, not its scandals. A place where dreams go to die under the weight of someone else's success. Phryne, or as her birth certificate might have said, Nazarite, was no one special on paper. No noble family, no powerful patrons, just one face that could stop an argument mid-sentence and possibly start a war. Imagine her stepping into Athens for the first time. Sunlight bouncing off the Acropolis, the air thick with ambition and the faint smell of flattery. Every face she passes is masked in politeness, every word wrapped in performance. This city doesn't reward honesty. It rewards illusion. Phryne learns quickly. She studies how the men speak, the rhythms of arrogance, the pauses of pretense. She learns that beauty, in Athens, isn't just admired, it's weaponized. Statues of gods and goddesses tower over the city, carved to mathematical perfection. And the message is clear: beauty equals power. The closer you look like marble, the more divine you are. It's a cruel economy. For women, beauty is both currency and curse. Ordinary wives are locked away indoors, their names forgotten after death. Courtesans, on the other hand, become legends, whispered about, painted, envied, condemned. Athens pretends to fear them, but secretly it can't function without them. At the height of the night, when the symposium torches burn low and laughter turns slurred, that's when Phryne begins her rise. She listens. She learns the art of silence, letting men project brilliance onto her while revealing absolutely nothing. A nod here, a smirk there, and suddenly, philosophers are quoting her in their lectures about the nature of beauty. Not bad for a girl from Thespii, but make no mistake, this isn't a fairy tale. Phryne knows exactly what she's doing. Every gesture, every glance, every calculated mystery becomes part of her persona. She doesn't sell herself. She sells the idea of herself, which is infinitely more profitable. And in that lies her genius. Athens runs on ideals. Virtue, reason, democracy. But ideals are fragile things. They crumble under reality. Phryne doesn't challenge those ideals. She mirrors them. She becomes the living embodiment of the thing Athens pretends to worship, beauty incarnate. Picture her at a banquet, silk draped like sunlight on her shoulders, hair perfumed with myrrh, laughter soft and dangerous. She doesn't need to speak loudly. People orbit her, desperate for a glance, a word, a fraction of acknowledgement. To the men of Athens, she's both temptation and theology. But underneath the music and candlelight, there's tension, because Phryne represents something the city can't control. She's proof that power doesn't always wear armor or hold office. Sometimes, it wears perfume and a knowing smile. Still, Athens needs its masks. The same men who toast her name will later denounce her as immoral. The same priests who preach modesty will secretly commission sculptures of her body. It's the original PR double standard, divinity for the gods, shame for the women who dare resemble them. Phryne walks that tightrope with terrifying grace. She's neither goddess nor mortal. She's the in-between. And the city, hypocritical as ever, can't decide whether to worship her or destroy her. Let's pause for a breath. Imagine living in a world where beauty was a divine obligation, not a personal trait, where your face could elevate or condemn you. Let that sink in. Marble ideals, flesh realities. Athens calls itself enlightened, but it's built on contradiction. They celebrate freedom, yet half their population is enslaved. They praise wisdom, yet silence half their citizens. Phryne saw through it, and instead of fighting the system, she learned to bend it until it begged for mercy. Night after night, her name echoes through the symposium halls. She becomes a myth in real time, her story morphing with every retelling. Some say she was arrogant, others call her divine. Maybe she was both. But one thing's certain. Phryne understood the theater of human nature better than anyone in that city of masks. Because Athens wasn't just a place, it was a performance. And every performance needs a star. By now, she's more than a woman. She's an idea. The courtesan who speaks softly but changes how men think about the divine. The mirror that reflects every unspoken desire and insecurity the city tries to hide. And that's what makes her dangerous. Not her body, not her beauty, but her ability to make people see themselves. As the night deepens, the laughter fades, and the torches sputter, Phryne steps out into the quiet streets. The city sleeps, but her legend doesn't. It's already spreading, twisting, transforming. She knows it, and somewhere behind her eyes, there's a spark, not of vanity, but of strategy. Because one day, Athens will put her on trial. And when that day comes, Phryne won't just stand before the law, she'll strip it bare. But that's a story for later. For now, the city of masks glitters beneath the moon, pretending it doesn't see the woman who's about to outweed it all. But what happens when a woman becomes the mirror Athens doesn't want to look into? Phryne wasn't born with gold in her hands, only the kind of face that could bankrupt it from someone else's wallet. Thespie, her hometown, was a place that smelled like dust, stone, and unrealized ambition. It was famous for two things: sculptors who dreamed of Athens, and people who never made it there. The kind of place that taught you early on that beauty fades, bread costs money, and survival was a full-time performance. Her real name, Nezaret, didn't roll off the tongue like Phryne. That name, Toad in Greek, by the way, was a stage name, a joke, and an act of rebellion all at once. Call it irony or survival branding. Because if Athens was going to judge her, she'd make sure it was for something worth remembering. You can almost picture her leaving Thespie, a young woman with no dowry, no protector, and nothing to lose. The road to Athens was a pilgrimage for the ambitious and the desperate. Poets chasing fame, soldiers chasing fortune, and courtesans chasing something far more elusive: autonomy. When Phryne first saw the city rising over the horizon, marble gleaming, the Parthenon like a crown of arrogance, she probably understood immediately that she wasn't walking into a home. She was walking into a stage. Athens wasn't kind to newcomers, especially women. Citizenship? Forget it. Legal rights? Non-existent. Respect? Conditional and expiring soon. But Phryne wasn't there to be respected. She was there to be remembered. She started small, blending into the background of the city's courtesan network. Every hetaira had her method. Some played the innocent, others the philosopher's muse. Phryne's genius was subtle. She played the divine. Not a woman pretending to be a goddess, but a goddess pretending to tolerate mortals. She knew how to use silence as power. When men bragged about their exploits, she'd just smile faintly, and they'd scramble to impress her. When they debated the nature of beauty, she was the counterargument sitting across from them, drinking their wine. Slowly, her name spread, whispered from symposium to symposium, painted in gossip and gilded in myth. She wasn't just beautiful, she was unsettling. Artists tried to capture her and failed. Poets described her as sunlight trapped in mortal form. One philosopher allegedly said, "To gaze upon her is to glimpse the divine and regret being human." Dramatic? Sure. But this was Athens. Exaggeration was a civic duty. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, that her first major patron asked her to sing for his guests. Phryne didn't sing. She simply stood, removed her veil, and looked at them. The room fell silent. It wasn't lust, not entirely. It was reverence. That's when she realized something powerful. Beauty, when wielded correctly, doesn't seduce, commands. And in a city obsessed with gods, she became one, not by decree, but by design. Athens was the influencer capital of the ancient world. Everyone wanted fame, whether through art, politics, or scandal. But fame came with danger. You could become immortal one day and exiled the next. Ask Socrates. Ask Alcibiades. Athens loved a spectacle, but it loved a downfall even more. Phryne understood this better than anyone. Every move she made was calculated, a balancing act between allure and mystery. She began appearing in temples, donating to festivals, commissioning art. But not out of piety, no, Phryne was curating her brand. She wanted to be seen as divine, to be whispered about in the same breath as Aphrodite herself. And soon enough she was. Artists started using her as a model for the goddess of love. Imagine the gossip. A mortal woman being sculpted as the divine embodiment of beauty. To some, it was blasphemy. To others, confirmation of her holiness. To Phryne, it was good publicity. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being so iconic that the divine department starts using your likeness without permission. That's not vanity, that's legacy management. But fame is a double-edged sword. The more people adored her, the more they resented her. In a city where male pride was as fragile as terracotta, Phryne became both muse and menace. Her beauty wasn't just physical, it was disruptive. It made people question their place in the cosmic hierarchy. If a mortal woman could embody divine perfection, what did that say about their gods? Or their wives? She began to attract artists. Painters, sculptors, philosophers. All circling her like moths around a flame. One of them was Praxiteles, the superstar sculptor of Greece. Their affair became legendary, a blend of love story and PR campaign. He sculpted the gods, but Phryne became the model for his masterpiece, the Aphrodite of Knidos, the first full nude statue of a goddess. It was controversial. The statue caused riots, pilgrimages, and theological crises. People traveled from across the Aegean just to see it. Some prayed before it. Some fainted. Some complained it was immoral, which in Greek roughly translates to, "I like it but don't want to admit it." Phryne watched all this unfold and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence did more than any speech could. By becoming art, she blurred the line between mortal and divine, sinner and saint, and that made her untouchable for now. But let's not romanticize it too much. Phryne was playing a dangerous game. The same city that raised her up could tear her down in a heartbeat. Power built on desire is like a temple built on sand, beautiful, unstable, and one strong breeze away from collapse. Still, for a while, she stood at the top. A courtesan who wasn't just desired, she was feared. Men compared her to Aphrodite in whispers, but never aloud. Artists immortalized her. Poets wept over her. Politicians funded her festivals, hoping the association would bless their careers. It was absurd, theatrical, and deeply human. Phryne, meanwhile, smiled through it all. She knew the truth. Beauty is temporary, but myth is forever. And if the city wanted to turn her into a symbol, she'd make sure it was one they couldn't forget or destroy. As her fame grew, so did the unease. The priests muttered that she mocked the gods. The judges whispered that she corrupted morality. The wives hated her. The husbands feared her. And Phryne? She just kept walking through the city like a living prayer, and a living scandal rolled into one. Let that image linger. A woman so powerful that even the divine started to look insecure. Because every era has its icons. Some burn bright and vanish. Others, like Phryne, learn to make their fire eternal. But every light casts a shadow. And in Athens, shadows have sharp teeth. Soon, the admiration would turn into accusation. The muse would become the target. And the same beauty that had built her empire would be put on trial. Here's the thing about the ancient Greeks: they didn't just like beauty. They were clinically obsessed with it. You think modern Instagram culture is bad? Try living in a world where your body was literally a reflection of divine favor. If your jawline was off, maybe you'd angered the gods. Acne? A cosmic punishment. The entire society functioned like one long runway show, except the judges were philosophers and priests, and the prize was existential validation. Athens in the 4th century BCE was basically the original influencer economy. Instead of ring lights, they had oil lamps. Instead of filters, marble. Everything was aesthetic. And not just casually, they mathematically measured beauty. Artists spoke in ratios, sculptors used compasses, and philosophers claimed that symmetry was the shadow of the divine. So, when someone like Phryne walked through the marketplace, she wasn't just admired, she was audited, evaluated, worshipped even. Let's set the scene. The temples glisten under the Athenian sun, every column a shrine to proportion. Statues of gods stand half-naked, unashamed, perfectly chiseled, and nobody bats an eye. But heaven forbid a woman look like that in real life. That's when the hypocrisy kicks in. And that's where Phryne becomes the glitch in the divine algorithm. Because she isn't marble, she's flesh. She sweats. She breathes. She exists outside their control. Yet she looks more divine than the gods themselves. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You've been told all your life that divinity is sculpted in temples. And then this woman walks by, and suddenly your prayers feel awkward. Artists notice first. Painters begin to sketch her. Sculptors start whispering her name. Poets run out of metaphors. Soon, her face starts showing up in art, but not as herself. Oh no, that would be too scandalous. She's Aphrodite. She's Pytho. She's any goddess they can name to disguise the truth. Phryne becomes the template for heaven itself, and no one wants to admit it. One of those artists is Praxiteles, her lover, the Michelangelo of his day, if Michelangelo had a better tan and a worse sense of humility. When he sculpts the goddess Aphrodite, he uses Phryne as his model. The result? A statue so beautiful that men sail across the sea just to see it, and women pray to it for better luck with their husbands. Some viewers weep, some faint, some accuse him of blasphemy. The irony? They're all right, because Phryne's beauty doesn't just blur the line between human and divine, it erases it. She is the line. And Athens, being the emotionally fragile metropolis it was, doesn't handle that well. Let's pause here. Think about how ridiculous this is. A civilization that worshipped naked statues, yet panicked when confronted with a real, living woman who looked like one. It's like praising art museums but banning selfies. The Greeks loved ideals, not realities. Phryne was a reality they couldn't curate, couldn't own, couldn't sculpt without her consent. And that terrified them. Rumors begin to circulate that her beauty isn't mortal, that she bathes in secret springs blessed by Aphrodite, that she's an oracle of seduction or worse, a divine punishment sent to humble Athens. It's superstition wrapped in envy, sprinkled with moral outrage, classic human behavior. But underneath the myths, there's something darker, fascination disguised as fear. Phryne becomes the embodiment of the thing men crave but can't control. And what do societies do when they can't control something? They try to regulate it, legislate it, or destroy it. Meanwhile, Phryne doesn't flinch. She's smart enough to know that every rumor, every accusation, only adds to her mystique. She doesn't fight the narrative. She curates it. When people say she's divine, she doesn't deny it. She smiles. Because in a city where everyone pretends to know what virtue looks like, she's selling the illusion better than anyone else. Let's slow down for a moment. The Greeks built temples to their ideals, yes, but they also built cages for their fears. Every statue of a goddess was also a warning. This is beauty, but not yours. Phryne didn't just break that rule. She turned it inside out. She made divinity human and humanity divine. The artists couldn't stop. Her image spread from sculpture to fresco, from fresco to festival banners. Her likeness appeared in temples. Her name whispered in hymns. The boundaries between art and worship started to blur. At one festival, a poet reportedly declared, "The gods take human form to walk among us." The crowd applauded, fully aware he was talking about her. But admiration has an expiration date. The more people worshipped Phryne, the more others began to resent her. Especially the priests, those gatekeepers of morality who didn't like the idea of someone freelancing in divine aesthetics. They accused her of hubris, excessive pride, the cardinal sin of mortals trying to act like gods. In Greek myth, hubris always ends the same way. Punishment. Icarus flew too high, Niobe bragged too loud, and Phryne, she looked too perfect. The gods, they said, were bound to notice. One day, a philosopher publicly claimed she was an insult to the divine, a mortal pretending to be what she could never be. Phryne's response? She paid a sculptor to carve her likeness and had it placed in Delphi, the holiest site in Greece. Beneath it, she inscribed her own name. Not Aphrodite, not Muse, not anonymous benefactor, just Phryne. It was the ancient Greek equivalent of saying, "Yes, I did that." And for a brief, intoxicating moment, Athens didn't know whether to kneel or riot. Let that sink in, a world built on worship, suddenly unsure what to do with the thing it accidentally created. Phryne's beauty had become religion, her presence a form of prayer. But gods, even the mortal ones, come with consequences. Because the moment society starts worshipping you, it starts plotting your downfall. And soon, the whispers of divinity would twist into accusations of blasphemy. The same faces that once gazed at her in awe would soon glare in judgment. But that's for another day, when the goddess must stand trial among men pretending to be gods. Every civilization has its defining moment, that one public spectacle where reality folds into myth and nobody is entirely sure what they just witnessed. For Athens, that moment came not in war or politics, but on a sunlit beach with one woman standing between the mortal and the divine. And, as usual, she wasn't wearing much. It was the Eleusinian festival, the city's grand carnival of rebirth, fertility, and public intoxication disguised as religion. Think Coachella, but with more olives and fewer shirts. Every year, priests, nobles, and peasants flocked to the shore in honor of Poseidon and Aphrodite, the sea god and the goddess of love, natural partners in both chaos and charm. The air was thick with salt, smoke, and human ego. And there, amid the noise, stood Phryne, silent, barefoot, and terrifyingly calm. Some say it was spontaneous. Others claim she'd planned it for weeks. But that morning, as the crowd prayed to Aphrodite, Phryne stepped forward, dropped her robe, and walked slowly into the sea. Let's pause here. Imagine the collective gasp. You could have heard it echo across the Aegean. The men froze mid-prayer. The priests choked on their incense. The poets stared like someone had ripped a page out of their own verses and brought it to life. Because at that moment, it wasn't a woman they were watching. It was Aphrodite herself, reborn from the waves. The sun hit her skin like polished bronze. The water curled around her ankles, almost reverent. Even the seagulls, normally obnoxious little thieves, seemed to fall silent. Phryne didn't flinch, didn't speak. She didn't need to. The performance was wordless and perfect. A living recreation of the goddess rising from the foam. The same scene sculptors had immortalized for centuries, now happening right in front of them. Was it blasphemy? Possibly. Was it genius? Absolutely. Because here's the trick. In ancient Greece, religion and theater were twins. The gods were as much performers as they were deities. And Phryne understood that better than anyone. She wasn't mocking the divine. She was collaborating with it. It's said that the crowd fell to their knees, whispering prayers not to the goddess, but to her. Priests, supposedly trained in piety, stood dumbstruck. And for a brief moment the hierarchy of heaven and earth inverted. The divine descended, or perhaps the mortal ascended. Now, cynics will say it was all a publicity stunt. That Phryne used religion the way influencers use charity galas, as stagecraft. Maybe, but even if it was calculated, the effect was undeniable. For that instant, she didn't just pretend to be a goddess. She was one. Let's take a reflective pause here. The human brain isn't wired to handle living symbols. When someone becomes the embodiment of an idea, beauty, purity, defiance, we stop seeing them as human. And when we stop seeing them as human, we start doing dangerous things. That day, Phryne crossed an invisible boundary. Before, she'd been admired. After, she'd be mythologized, and myths always come with a price tag. The story spread like wildfire. Travelers carried tales of the woman who rose from the sea. Artists rushed to capture her likeness. The poets exaggerated it, of course. One wrote that the ocean itself froze in devotion. Another claimed lightning struck nearby as Zeus himself looked down in approval. History, as usual, went heavy on the drama. But what's interesting isn't how the story grew. It's what it revealed. For all their philosophy, the Greeks still couldn't handle power when it wore a feminine face. Men could command armies and sculpt gods, but a woman commanding attention was somehow unnatural. And Phryne? She'd just become the most natural, unnatural thing in all of Athens. Soon, her performance became more than gossip, it became theology. Her walk into the sea was retold in temples as a moment of divine revelation. Some worshippers even began lighting candles to her image, quietly, in corners of Aphrodite's shrines. Others condemned her as a heretic. But here's the irony. The same men who denounced her also commissioned statues of her the next day. Morality was always flexible when art or lust was involved. Phryne, ever strategic, said nothing. She didn't claim divinity, but she didn't deny it either. Because denial breaks the illusion. And illusions, when maintained properly, pay very well. She retreated for a while after that, maybe to avoid the backlash, maybe just to let the legend breathe. The less people saw her, the bigger her story became. Mystery is the best marketing tool of all time. She turned absence into a lure, silence into scripture. But in the cracks of admiration, resentment started to grow. The priests whispered that she mocked the gods. The philosophers argued that she was corrupting the youth with her example. The politicians grumbled that she wielded more influence than any statesman could. Athens was losing control of its own narrative. You can almost hear the conversations over wine. Who does she think she is? A goddess. Exactly. Let that sink in. A woman using her body not for submission, but subversion. Turning shame into art, vulnerability into dominance. It wasn't just rebellion, it was strategy disguised as spectacle. But myths don't stay friendly forever. Every act of adoration eventually curdles into accusation. And every goddess, no matter how adored, must face the mortal hunger for balance. The need to drag the divine back down to earth. So yes, that moment at the sea made her immortal. But it also made her a target. Because you can only embody perfection for so long before someone decides it's their duty to destroy it. For now, though, picture that shoreline. Golden light, whispering waves, a woman shimmering like a reflection of the gods themselves. Nobody there knew they were watching history's most daring act of self-creation. Nobody knew that one day, this same woman would stand before a court accused of impiety, of offending the very goddess she'd once been mistaken for. But in that instant, standing waist-deep in the Aegean, Phryne wasn't a courtesan, or a mortal, or even a scandal. She was an idea, a question, a challenge. And questions, as Athens would soon learn, are far more dangerous than sins. For a city that prided itself on wisdom, Athens had the emotional maturity of a jealous ex. The same people who once gasped in awe at Phryne's sea-born radiance were now whispering behind her back, clutching their pearls, metaphorically and literally, because admiration in Athens had a shelf life. It always rotted into envy, and envy, when dressed up in a toga, called itself justice. Phryne's fame spread faster than scandal in a wine-soaked symposium. Her likeness was everywhere, carved into temples, painted onto pottery, whispered through the marketplace. And while the artists adored her, the moral gatekeepers, those self-appointed referees of decency, started losing sleep. To them, Phryne was no longer a woman. She was a symbol of everything wrong with society. Luxury, pride, sensuality, and worst of all, power without permission. You know the type, the kind of men who could visit brothels at night and preach virtue at dawn. Hypocrisy wasn't a vice in Athens. It was a civic art form. The city's elite began to turn on her. Politicians mocked her influence. Philosophers moralized about her corruption. Priests muttered that she insulted the gods. Never mind that she donated generously to temples, funded public works, and inspired art that tourists would be gaping at for centuries. None of that mattered because she'd broken the unspoken rule. She'd become untouchable, and Athens didn't like women who weren't afraid of being touched. Let's pause for a second. This is where history always gets predictable. A woman rises. Society applauds briefly. Then comes the backlash disguised as righteousness. The same cycle that destroyed Sappho, Hypatia, and, well, anyone who dared to outshine their male peers. Because power in feminine form was like lightning. Admired from afar, feared up close. And for Phryne, the lightning was about to strike. It started as murmurs, that she was too proud, too divine, too blasphemous. Then came the accusations, that she mocked the gods by comparing herself to Aphrodite, that she performed sacrilegious rituals, that she corrupted the youth with her unholy charm. Sound familiar? It's the same vague nonsense they used to kill Socrates, except this time the accused wasn't a philosopher. She was a courtesan, which, in Athenian moral logic, made her doubly guilty. Her accusers framed it perfectly. Phryne wasn't just beautiful. She was dangerous. They said she tempted the gods themselves. They claimed her beauty was unnatural, maybe even magical. Some whispered she used potions and charms, others that she'd cursed men into obsession. The ancient equivalent of witchcraft, always the convenient label for women who couldn't be controlled. And just like that, the city that once adored her began sharpening its knives. But why? Why go after someone who, by all accounts, was harmless or at least entertaining? Because Phryne represented the one thing Athens couldn't process: female agency that wasn't tragic, humble, or sanctioned by marriage. She was living proof that you could defy the script and still win. And that kind of freedom, to men whose egos depended on control, felt like treason. The priests fumed that she had stolen the goddess's image for profit. The orators thundered that she made fools of honorable men. The playwrights wrote thinly veiled satires about a woman who thought herself divine. It was open season on Phryne. Still, she didn't cower. She didn't issue tearful denials or public apologies. She kept hosting gatherings, kept appearing at festivals, kept living like a myth that refused to die. And that terrified them more than anything, because there's nothing scarier to self-righteous men than a woman who isn't afraid of their disapproval. Then came the breaking point. Phryne was officially charged with impiety, the same crime that killed Socrates 40 years earlier. Capital offense. The accusation that she'd insulted the gods by imitating Aphrodite and profaning sacred rituals. That her beauty itself was an act of hubris, a challenge to divine order. You have to appreciate the irony. Athens, a city overflowing with naked statues of gods, was suddenly scandalized by a living woman's body. Hypocrisy so pure it could have been bottled and sold as perfume. Her trial became the event of the decade. People poured into the city like it was a festival. Merchants sold refreshments, poets scribbled dramatic predictions, and every philosopher suddenly had an opinion. The irony? Half the jury probably recognized her from previous appointments. But this wasn't just gossip anymore. This was life or death. And while Phryne had made a career out of commanding attention, This was a tension she didn't control. Let's take a breath here, because this is the pivot point. The moment where admiration collapses into punishment. Where a society, unable to own its contradictions, tries to destroy the person who exposes them. Phryne's lawyer, if you can call him that, was the famous orator Hyperides. Smart, persuasive, and conveniently one of her former lovers. He knew logic wouldn't save her. Athens didn't care about truth, cared about spectacle. As the court assembled, the tension was electric. 1,000 eyes fixed on her. Some in pity, some in lust, most in moral superiority. The air was thick with hypocrisy and incense, that eternal Athenian blend. The accusations poured out. She pretends to be a goddess. She defiles sacred festivals. She leads men astray. Hyperides countered with wit and rhetoric. But the jury wasn't swayed. They wanted blood. Phryne stood silent, calm, radiant. The men who once cheered her were now ready to condemn her. And yet, there's that glimmer, that sense that she knows what's coming. You can almost see it behind her eyes. The understanding that in a world built on image, the only way to survive is to turn the mirror back on your accusers. The city that had worshipped her beauty was about to see just how dangerous that worship could be. The trial would soon reach its breaking point. Words would fail, logic would crumble, and the one defense that no man dared expect or resist would shatter the illusion of Athenian virtue forever. Because Phryne wasn't going to plead her case. She was going to reveal it. Picture this. The marble halls of Athens' Supreme Court, packed shoulder to shoulder with men who have spent years pretending not to know the defendant. The city's best and brightest, philosophers, politicians, priests, and professional hypocrites, all gathered to pass judgment on a woman who'd already owned their hearts, their wallets, and, in a few cases, their evenings. The air smells of olive oil, sweat, and moral superiority. Welcome to the trial of Phryne, the most scandalous courtroom drama of the ancient world. Now, to understand the absurdity here, you need to know what these men are actually doing. They're accusing Phryne, a woman whose likeness they'd already carved into temples, of impiety or offending the gods. Essentially, they're saying, how dare she act like a goddess? While sitting under statues of naked gods who look like gym models, Athens was a city allergic to irony, and this trial was Exhibit A. The charge was serious. Impiety could mean death, and not the poetic kind, the actual drink hemlock like Socrates kind. For a woman, that often meant being tossed into the sea in a sack. Romantic, right? Phryne arrived not as a broken woman, but as a performer stepping onto her stage. She wore a simple robe, no gold, no jewelry, no makeup. Let them underestimate her. She'd always known that beauty was her greatest weapon, but timing was everything. Today, she would wield it like a blade. Her defense attorney, Hyperides, was not just a brilliant orator but also one of her former lovers, which meant he knew her power firsthand. He stood before the court, dramatic, passionate, and a little desperate. His words poured out in rhythmic waves, each one trying to wash away the accusation. She does not offend the gods, he proclaimed. She honors them. Is it her fault that her beauty reflects the divine? You can imagine the jury's faces, half skeptical, half terrified to make eye contact. Because deep down, they all knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Phryne did look like a goddess. The problem was that mortals weren't supposed to compete. Hyperides launched into philosophy, quoting Plato, referencing poetry, throwing logic at men who barely believed in it. But the more he spoke, the colder the room became. The jurors' faces hardened. They weren't there to be convinced. They were there to cleanse their guilt. That's when Hyperides, in a moment of desperate genius or theatrical madness, decided to change tactics. Words weren't working, so he switched languages entirely, from rhetoric to revelation. He walked over to Phryne. The crowd murmured. Then, in one swift motion, he tore open her robe. Gasps, shouts, the sound of 1,000 moral codes collapsing in real time. There she stood, Phryne, unveiled before the court, her skin gleaming in the pale Athenian light. The silence that followed was almost holy. Hyperides raised his hands. "Men of Athens," he said, "behold the living image of Aphrodite. Will you condemn this as impious? Would you dare insult the goddess herself by punishing her reflection? It was audacious. It was manipulative. It was genius. Let's pause. Imagine the scene. A culture that worships statues of naked gods is suddenly confronted with a living one. Not marble, but breathing, blinking, undeniably human. You could almost hear the moral circuitry frying in their heads. Half the jury turned red. The other half probably pretended to look away but didn't. The courtroom, once heavy with condemnation, now hung in stunned silence. Hyperides had done the impossible. He turned judgment into awe. And Phryne? She didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood there like a statue come to life, calm, radiant, unashamed. In that stillness, she took back every ounce of power Athens had tried to steal. Her beauty wasn't just on display, it was on trial. And it won. Because the truth is, these men weren't moral arbiters. They were audience members. And Phryne gave them the performance of their lives. Eventually, the murmurs began. Then the whispers. Then a collective, unspoken surrender. The judges, terrified of offending Aphrodite by condemning her alleged mirror, voted to acquit. Just like that, Phryne was free. Let that sink in. She won her freedom not with logic, not with tears, but with presence. Of course, the official record was sanitized. Later historians claimed her robe merely slipped. Sure. And the Parthenon accidentally built itself. The truth was inconvenient, but everyone knew it. Phryne had beaten Athens at its own game. Outside the courthouse, the city buzzed. Some called it justice. Others called it blasphemy. The priests were furious, the poets euphoric, and the gossip unstoppable. Overnight, Phryne went from courtesan to legend. Some even said she'd proven herself divine, not because of her body, but because she'd survived the judgment of men. But victory is a dangerous drug, because once you've stared down society and won, the world doesn't forgive you. It just waits for you to stumble. Let's take a breath here. Picture her walking out of that courtroom. The crowd parting like the Red Sea, men whispering prayers under their breath, women watching with awe and envy. She didn't celebrate. She didn't speak. She just smiled. The kind of smile that says, "I told you so," without needing to. Athens pretended to move on, but something fundamental had shifted. The trial had exposed the city's dirty secret. Its so-called morality was just theater. The judges weren't defending faith. They were defending comfort. And Phryne, by standing bare before them, had stripped that comfort away. They had condemned her for being divine and acquitted her for being exactly that. The irony? Her accusers vanished into obscurity. Her name, meanwhile, would echo for millennia. Still, behind the triumph, a shadow lingered, because when you defeat shame itself, you also inherit its ghost. Phryne had survived, but she'd also become a myth. And myths, unlike mortals, don't get to rest. For now, though, she'd won. She had done what no philosopher, no general, no statesman had ever achieved. She'd used beauty, that most fragile of weapons, to shatter the foundations of hypocrisy. And somewhere, perhaps on Mount Olympus, Aphrodite probably raised a glass. There are courtroom dramas. And then there's this. No gavels, no powdered wigs. Just marble columns, sweaty jurors, and one woman standing half-naked in front of 200 men pretending to be morally conflicted. The scene looked less like a legal proceeding and more like the world's most awkward art exhibit. And yet, somehow, this moment, this silent, scandalous tableau, would become one of the most legendary acts of defiance in human history. Let's rewind 2 seconds to that gasp. The collective sound of hypocrisy imploding. When Hyperides ripped open Phryne's robe, the court went from pompous to petrified. You could practically hear every philosopher's fragile worldview snapping in half. These men had built entire ideologies around virtue, restraint, and the sanctity of the gods. And now, one woman had made all of it irrelevant. For the first time in their lives, the jurors didn't know what to do. They weren't looking at a criminal anymore. They were looking at a revelation. Flesh and divinity, guilt and beauty, all colliding in one impossible moment. Phryne wasn't ashamed. She wasn't afraid. She was radiant. The sunlight spilling through the columns hit her like a spotlight, her stillness louder than any orator's plea. You could almost feel the cosmic irony. Athens, the city that worshipped idealized naked statues, was now paralyzed by the real thing. The same men who praised sculptors for chiseling the curves of Aphrodite now clutched their cloaks like scandalized nuns. If the gods were watching, they were probably laughing. Hyperides seized the silence. His voice, calm and trembling all at once, echoed through the hall. "Men of Athens," he began, "you see before you not a sinner, but a miracle. Would you dare condemn the beauty that even the gods have blessed?" It was manipulative, sure, but brilliant. He knew these men didn't fear sin, they feared divine retribution. And what better way to protect his client than to suggest that killing her would be a cosmic offense? He gestured toward her like a prophet unveiling a relic. "This beauty," he said, "is proof of divine favor. To punish her would be to insult Aphrodite herself." The courtroom was no longer a trial, it was a sermon. The jurors sat frozen, suspended between reason and superstition. And Phryne? She stood perfectly still, breathing softly, her eyes meeting theirs. Not pleading, not performing, simply being. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't argue her innocence. She embodied it. She turned her body, the very thing they accused her of weaponizing, into a sacred artifact. The message was simple and devastating. If beauty is divine, then I am beyond your judgment. Let's pause here. Think about what she just did. In an instant, she flipped the moral hierarchy upside down. The judges, the priests, the lawmakers, all these men who thought they held power, suddenly looked like children scolding a thunderstorm. And slowly the fear set in. Because what if Hyperides was right? What if Phryne really was favored by the gods? What if punishing her brought down divine wrath? Ancient Greeks loved logic until lightning got involved. No one wanted to be the guy who pissed off Aphrodite. One juror reportedly trembled so hard he dropped his stylus. Another crossed himself, to which his neighbor hissed, "Wrong religion." Within minutes, the entire room shifted from righteous indignation to pure panic. Hyperides milked the silence for all it was worth. "Do you not see?" he cried. "Even her silence condemns you. The gods themselves speak through her grace." Translation: look at her. Do you really want that on your conscience? It worked. Of course it did. The Athenians had no defense against spectacle. They built their entire culture on it. Tragedy, theater, oratory, all of it was about performance. And Phryne, the courtesan they tried to shame, had just outperformed every actor in Greece. When the verdict was finally announced, it wasn't even close. The judges voted to acquit. The charges of impiety were dropped, and Phryne, the woman who'd supposedly mocked the gods, walked free because her accusers were too scared she was won. The crowd outside erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it proof that beauty could corrupt the law itself. The priests muttered curses under their breath. The poets sharpened their quills. And the jurors? They probably went home and told their wives they'd done the honorable thing. Phryne said nothing. She simply draped her robe back over her shoulders and walked out. Slow, silent, serene. That silence was her final argument. A kind of divine mic drop. But let's not romanticize it too neatly. This wasn't just a triumph. It was a reveal. Phryne had exposed the truth that Athens didn't want to face. Their morality was theater. Their justice system a script written by fear. And the audience? Complicit. She'd proven that the same beauty they tried to weaponize against her could dismantle their entire illusion of control. They wanted to shame her body, and she turned it into proof of innocence. They wanted to punish her defiance, and she turned it into art. Let that sink in. A single gesture, one robe falling, shifted the balance of power in a city that thought it had already perfected it. After the trial, her legend grew even larger. Artists rushed to depict her moment of triumph. Poets compared her to Aphrodite herself, emerging victorious from the sea of judgment. The story spread across the Aegean, across generations, and every retelling got a little grander, a little more divine. But beneath the glory, there was a quiet truth, a dangerous one. Phryne had survived not because she was innocent, but because she understood how to manipulate guilt. The Athenians didn't free her because they believed her. They freed her because they feared what it would mean if they didn't. So yes, she won. But it wasn't just justice. It was theater weaponized to perfection. And maybe that's the real moral of this story. In a world built on spectacle, the person who controls the audience controls everything. For now, though, Phryne walked free, no longer just a courtesan, not quite a goddess, but something infinitely more dangerous. An idea. The verdict spread across Athens faster than cheap wine at a symposium. Phryne is free, they whispered, half in awe, half in outrage. A city that prided itself on reason had just been hypnotized by a pair of shoulders and a well-timed silence. And whether they admitted it or not, everyone knew it. Outside the courthouse, the crowds were electric. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Philosophers abandoned their dignity. People jostled to catch a glimpse of the woman who had stood naked before the law and walked away untouched. It wasn't just a trial that ended that day, it was an illusion. The illusion that shame could control her. That morality, as defined by men, was anything but theater. Athens loved its myths, but Phryne had just become one. Let's imagine her leaving the courthouse. The same marble streets that once buzzed with judgment now hum with applause. The men who condemned her yesterday now bow their heads as she passes. A silent, begrudging acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something transcendent, even if they couldn't explain it. And Phryne? She doesn't gloat. She doesn't smile. She just walks, steady, poised, unbothered. Because the truth is, when you've stripped your soul bare before a city that worships marble gods, nothing scares you anymore. Still, Athens didn't take defeat well. Overnight, the gossip machine turned on itself. Half the city claimed she was divinely blessed. The other half said she'd bewitched the judges. One poet wrote that justice herself blushed before her beauty. Another sneered that the gods had gone blind. It was chaos wrapped in philosophy. But beneath the noise, something subtle had shifted. Phryne had done what no man, not even Socrates, had achieved. She'd survived Athens' moral judgment and turned it into art. Her nakedness wasn't scandal anymore. It was symbol. The human body, once a source of shame, had just become a weapon of truth. And that terrified people. Because shame in Athens wasn't just an emotion, it was currency. It kept women obedient, slaves silent, citizens compliant. But Phryne had just proven that shame only works if you agree to feel it. The moment you stop apologizing for who you are, the whole system falls apart. Let that sink in. A city that built its identity on control, on balance, on order, just watched a courtesan rewrite the rules without even speaking. After the trial, Athens became obsessed with her. Artists wanted to immortalize her. Philosophers debated her divine nature. Drunken men quoted her case as an excuse for everything from adultery to tax evasion. Phryne was everywhere, and yet nowhere, because after her victory, she vanished from the public eye. Some said she went into hiding, fearing revenge. Others believed she retired to Thespes, surrounded by statues of the gods she'd outshone. But the truth? Phryne didn't retreat. She evolved. She understood something that most powerful people never do, that overexposure kills mystique. So she let the legend do the talking. And what a legend it became. Every retelling grew grander. Some claimed Aphrodite herself descended during the trial to shield her. Others swore the sunlight had dimmed in reverence when her robe fell. History blurred into myth, and Phryne, that clever girl from a dusty little town, had become immortal through rumor. But immortality comes with a curse. The more perfect her image became, the less human she was allowed to be. People didn't see Phryne anymore, they saw an icon, a moral battleground. Was she a sinner or a saint? A manipulator or a muse? No one knew, and that was the beauty of it. Phryne had become whatever people needed her to be, their fantasy, their fear, their mirror. Still, behind the myth, there must have been fatigue. The kind that comes from always being the story, never the storyteller. Because make no mistake, surviving judgment doesn't erase its scars. You can win, but the echo of accusation lingers. Sometimes, in those quiet moments, When the parties faded, the artists went home, and the city slept, she must have thought about the absurdity of it all, that her survival depended not on truth or virtue, but on spectacle, that she had to expose herself to earn the right to exist. And yet, maybe that was her greatest triumph, turning vulnerability into dominance. By refusing to flinch, she had forced an entire civilization to confront its own hypocrisy. Let's breathe that in for a second, the idea that true power isn't about control or conquest, but composure. The ability to stand unashamed in a world addicted to shame. Because Phryne didn't just win her freedom. She cracked the foundation of Athenian virtue. Her trial proved that morality at its core was just performance, and she had outperformed them all. The priests still fumed. The politicians still schemed. The poets still exaggerated. But Athens would never be quite the same again. The woman they tried to punish had become a living contradiction. Both sinner and saint, victim and victor. And in that contradiction, she found her immortality. In time, her story spread beyond Greece. Roman historians retold it, Christian moralists condemned it, and Renaissance painters resurrected it. Each version reshaped her, polished her, mythologized her. The details changed, but the essence remained. Phryne, the woman who used shame as a weapon, beauty as a defense, and silence as the ultimate argument. Centuries later, when people would stand before the marble statues of goddesses, those serene, perfect forms carved in her likeness, they'd feel something they couldn't name. Reverence, discomfort, envy, the faint memory of a woman who once made beauty look like rebellion. And maybe that's what haunted Athens most. Not that she defied the gods, but that she didn't need them. She'd proven that you could be divine without divine permission. Her story ended the way all legends do, not with death but with transformation. The courtesan became a myth. The accused became immortal. The woman who'd walked into court naked left behind a civilization that would never look at beauty or power the same way again. Because when Phryne walked free, something else broke free with her. Shame, fear, the old moral order that kept people small. And that's the thing about truth. Once it's naked, you can't dress it back up again. The courtroom was behind her, the whispers fading into myth. But Phryne knew something Athens didn't. Survival was temporary. Image was forever. You could silence a person, you couldn't erase a statue. And so, while the rest of the city was still arguing about whether she was divine or diabolical, she quietly began the next act of her story, turning her body into eternity. The irony was delicious. Athens had tried to shame her flesh. Now it would be immortalized in marble. Her lover, Praxiteles, was the most celebrated sculptor in Greece, a man whose chisel was said to breathe life. His statues were perfection made tangible. Calm faces, fluid lines, bodies that looked halfway between dreaming and divine. The kind of art that made you forget you were looking at stone. And, as luck or poetic symmetry would have it, Phryne was his muse. Their relationship was a masterpiece of mutual exploitation, art and ambition, lust and legend intertwined. He adored her beauty, and she understood exactly what his adoration could do for her legacy. She wasn't just posing for statues, she was curating her afterlife. Let's pause for a second and appreciate the strategy. The men of Athens could argue her morality all they wanted. She'd already made sure that, centuries later, people would be studying her form, not their words. One day, while working in his studio, Praxiteles began sculpting a figure that would scandalize the world. The Aphrodite of Knidos, the first fully nude statue of a goddess. Before this, the gods had always been modestly draped, conveniently half-clothed for public comfort. But Praxiteles shattered that boundary. And his model, Phryne, when the statue was unveiled, Greece collectively lost its mind. Crowds swarmed to see it. Pilgrims traveled across the Aegean. And rumors spread that sailors changed their routes just to glimpse it. Priests called it sacrilegious. Poets called it perfect. And all the while, Phryne smiled quietly in the background, knowing she had just merged flesh with divinity. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just a sculpture. It was an act of resurrection. Phryne had turned her mortal body, the one that had stood on trial, that men had feared, judged, and desired, into an immortal symbol. Every curve of stone, every line of her body was now worshipped in temples, admired by travelers, and copied endlessly by artists who didn't even know her name. The woman they'd tried to destroy had become their goddess of beauty. Literally. Imagine the poetry of that. The same city that once condemned her for imitating Aphrodite now prayed before her image as Aphrodite herself. If irony had a religion, this would be its high holiday. And yet, beneath all that triumph, there's something haunting about it. Because marble may be eternal, but it's cold. It captures perfection but erases presence. Phryne's body lived on, but not her voice, her laughter, her calculated wit. The woman became a symbol, and symbols can't defend themselves. Let's take a quiet pause here. Breathe that in the paradox of immortality. You can be remembered forever, and still be forgotten in every way that matters. But Phryne understood this too. She wasn't naive. She knew legends aren't born out of truth. They're born out of control. And in a world that tried to define her, she decided to define herself first. Every artist who sculpted her, every priest who condemned her, every poet who compared her to a goddess, they all became participants in the myth she built. There's a lesser-known story about a statue of her own likeness, one not disguised as Aphrodite. It stood in Delphi, the holiest site in Greece, right beside the monument to kings and philosophers. On its base, carved in sharp, simple letters, one word: Phryne. No title, no divine alias, just her name, and that, more than anything, was her final declaration. Not goddess, not sinner, not property, person. Of course, the Athenians tried to downplay it. They said it was a benefactor's tribute or a misunderstanding of devotion. But deep down, they knew what it was: a quiet act of rebellion etched in stone. Because that statue wasn't just her image. It was her revenge. It said, "You tried to judge me, now you'll worship me. You tried to erase me, now I'll be the face of your gods. You called me shameful, now I am the standard of beauty itself." And for centuries they did worship her. Pilgrims touched the marble as if it could bless them. Artists copied her form in painting after painting, generation after generation. Even when Rome replaced Greece, the statues remained, copied, renamed, remade. But the essence? Still Phryne. Her immortality wasn't granted by the gods. It was engineered by her own understanding of human weakness. She knew people would forget names, laws, even empires, but they'd never forget the shape of desire. That's the trick, isn't it? We build temples for what we fear losing, and Athens feared losing beauty most of all. Let's zoom out for a second. A courtesan from Thespy, accused of blasphemy, condemned for vanity, ends up becoming the face of their highest ideal. The very thing she was punished for becomes the reason she's remembered. That's not history. That's poetic justice with perfect symmetry. Even now, when archaeologists dig up fragments of Praxiteles' Aphrodite, they describe it the same way. Serene, graceful, unattainable. They speak of it as divinity, never realizing they're still doing exactly what Athens did, worshipping an illusion crafted by a mortal woman who refused to apologize for existing. And maybe that's the lasting irony of Phryne's story. The city that tried to define her ended up defined by her instead. She turned shame into sculpture, trial into theater, and flesh into legend. Her body may have aged, her voice may have faded, but her image outlasted them all, frozen, flawless, eternal. So yes, the Athenians had their philosophers, their generals, their gods, but only one woman ever forced them to confront their own reflection and made them bow. Phryne didn't die, she just changed materials. Let's be honest, beauty's always been a kind of currency. It can open doors, ruin reputations, and fund empires faster than any politician's promise. But Phryne, she didn't just spend beauty, she minted it. In an age where women were legally categorized somewhere between property and pious background decoration, Phryne turned attraction into an economy. After her acquittal, the city's fascination with her didn't fade. It inflated. Overnight, her name became synonymous with luxury, charm, and danger. Aristocrats sent her gifts just to be ignored. Poets sent her verses just to be mocked. Artists begged her to sit for them again, though most would have paid just to be in the same room. And Phryne, ever the strategist, didn't waste the attention. She turned fame into fortune. By the time Athens realized it, the courtesan they once called scandalous had become one of the richest women in Greece. How? Simple. She understood supply and demand, and more importantly, perception. Let's take a quick detour through Athenian economics. Money back then wasn't just silver coins, it was reputation, favors, patronage. A good name could make you powerful. A whispered rumor could bankrupt you. For men, influence came through politics or war. For women, especially one like Phryne, it came through control of desire. And she mastered that market with terrifying precision. Clients didn't just pay Phryne for pleasure, they paid for proximity to myth. Every encounter was a transaction of ego. To dine with her was to feel godlike. To touch her was to touch history. To be rejected by her? That was the ultimate luxury, proof you'd aimed too high. The rumors became their own kind of economy. People said she charged entire fortunes for an evening, 10 talents, 50, 100. No one really knew. That was the genius. By never confirming her price, she made herself priceless. Her house became a kind of temple, not of sin, but of spectacle. Sculptures, perfumes, silks, exotic pets. A curated chaos of wealth that told every visitor, "You are in the presence of rarity." She entertained philosophers and generals, poets and priests, and made all of them feel like minor characters in her myth. And if that sounds manipulative, good. Because Phryne knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't sell affection. She sold aspiration. One legend claims that when the city of Thebes was destroyed, Phryne offered to fund its reconstruction, on one condition: that they carve the words "destroyed by Alexander, rebuilt by Phryne the courtesan" across the city gates. Thebes declined, of course. They preferred ruin to gratitude. But that was the point. She wasn't joking. She was making a statement. Imagine it. A woman once dragged to court for her body, now offering to outspend kings. A courtesan daring to put her name where only conquerors' names belonged. It wasn't arrogance. It was theater. A living reminder that power isn't inherited. It's performed. Let's slow that down. What Phryne understood, centuries before anyone coined the term, was branding. Every appearance, every silence, every scandal part of the show. She didn't just survive the male gaze. She monetized it, patented it, and sold it back to them with interest. And Athens couldn't get enough. Because deep down, the city was addicted to contradiction. Purity preached by sinners, virtue debated by drunks, beauty worshipped by the insecure. Phryne didn't fight that hypocrisy. She embodied it. Still, it wasn't just vanity. She invested her wealth, estates, slaves, temples, vineyards. She even bankrolled religious festivals, slipping her name into civic history like a subtle watermark. And every time the priests blessed the ceremonies she funded, they unknowingly blessed the woman they once tried to destroy. There's a calm ruthlessness to her legacy. She didn't rebel with swords or speeches. She rebelled by existing elegantly, unapologetically, profitably. Let's pause. Can you feel the irony? The city that once tried to reduce her to nothing now revolved around her shadow. Men traded stories about her like currency. Her name alone could make or break reputations. Somewhere, Socrates was rolling in his grave, assuming he wasn't too busy regretting not meeting her first. And yet, behind the spectacle, there was something more profound happening. Phryne wasn't just amassing wealth. She was rewriting the social contract. In a world where women were silenced, she'd found the one language men couldn't ignore: desire. And she spoke it fluently. Still, power is never permanent. Every coin has two sides: admiration and resentment. The same beauty that built her empire also cursed her with isolation. Because when you become legend, you stop being human. People no longer see you, they see what you represent. So she retreated bit by bit. Let the world talk. Let the poets exaggerate. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. Her statues did that for her. But her story spread further than she could ever travel. Across Greece, Her name became shorthand for impossible beauty, both worshipped and feared. Artists copied her likeness. Dramatists wrote plays about her trial. Philosophers used her as an example in lectures about virtue, irony, and the corruption of power. Even centuries later, her name appeared in Roman gossip scrolls, right beside emperors and gods. The courtesan from Thespii had done what kings dream of, turned her life into currency and her legend into compound interest. And maybe that's the moral wrapped in all her marble glamour. Money fades, power shifts, but myth appreciates over time. Phryne knew it better than anyone. She didn't just play the game. She redesigned the board. Let's take a breath. Picture her now, years after the trial, reclining in her courtyard, the sun glinting off her jewelry, listening to young men whisper her name like a prayer they don't quite believe in. She's older, wiser, quieter, but in her eyes, that same flicker, the knowledge that she's already won. Because the economy she built isn't made of drachmas or silver. It's made of memory, and that, unlike beauty, never fades. By now, Phryne had become something that terrified Athens even more than scandal, an idea that refused to die. She wasn't just a courtesan or a symbol of beauty anymore. She was a living paradox, walking proof that flesh could be philosophy. And if there was one thing philosophers hated, it was being out-argued without a single word. You have to picture the irony. Athens, the intellectual capital of the world, filled with men who wrote entire scrolls about the form of beauty. They debated whether virtue could exist without perfection, whether the divine could inhabit the mortal. Meanwhile, Phryne just existed, silently demonstrating the answer in a way no symposium could. She was the unspoken thesis of every philosophical argument, and the inconvenient footnote they wished they could erase. To Plato, beauty was divine order. To Aristotle, it was symmetry. To the poets, it was punishment wrapped in longing. But Phryne? She didn't theorize it, she embodied it. She turned abstraction into anatomy, metaphysics into movement. She didn't discuss divinity. She made it uncomfortable by breathing. Let's pause and breathe that in. Imagine being so magnetic that entire schools of thought form just to justify your existence, and then collapse under their own hypocrisy. Athens loved to divide the world into mind versus body, soul versus sin. Men were encouraged to ascend beyond flesh, unless, of course, the flesh in question was beautiful and conveniently not theirs. Philosophers talked about reason as if desire were an illness. But every time Phryne entered a room, desire walked in wearing a crown and a quiet smirk. She wasn't anti-intellectual. She just refused to play their game. When men tried to debate her value, she simply lived it. When they wrote poems about her, she became their muse and their mockery all at once. Because that was her real talent, not beauty, but clarity. She made Athens see itself without the comforting fog of philosophy. And the city didn't like that reflection. There's an old story, maybe apocryphal, maybe poetic, that during one of Athens' more pretentious symposia, a philosopher tried to lecture Phryne about the nature of the good. He droned on for hours about virtue, balance, moderation. Phryne listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When he finally paused, smug and expectant, she asked softly, "And what good is your virtue if it fears what it desires?" Then she stood, walked away, and left the room in silence. That one sentence was worth more than every scroll in his library, because that's what Phryne did. She turned hypocrisy into a mirror. She forced people to confront the dissonance between their words and their wants. And she did it with grace, not cruelty. She never shouted, never argued. She simply was. Let's slow it down for a reflective moment. The human body has always made people uncomfortable. Too sacred to ignore, too sinful to embrace. Phryne lived at that crossroads, a reminder that flesh isn't the enemy of thought. It's the evidence of it. She blurred the lines between holiness and hunger, between reverence and lust, and in doing so, exposed the truth, that beauty and intellect aren't opposites, they're accomplices. Over time, the philosophers began to shift. Some condemned her, calling her a corrupter of morals. Others, more honest, admitted that she represented something profound, that beauty could elevate the soul, not degrade it. Praxiteles' statue of her as Aphrodite became their visual proof. Every pilgrim who stood before that sculpture, awed and humbled, was participating in her silent debate. If beauty is divine, then why are we so afraid of it in life? It's fascinating how the same society that worshipped perfection in marble recoiled when it breathed. They could pray to a statue of a nude goddess but condemn the woman who inspired it. That's the kind of doublethink only humans could invent, worshipping the ideal while crucifying the real. Phryne understood this duality better than anyone. She'd lived it. She'd been adored and condemned, exalted and exiled, often in the same sentence. And yet, she never lost control of her narrative. She remained calm, detached, as if she were in on a cosmic joke that everyone else was too serious to understand. She once said, or was rumored to have said, "They worship what I represent and hate that I exist." That single line captures her perfectly. A woman so self-aware she turned contradiction into power. In her later years, Phryne was often invited to philosophical gatherings, not as a performer but as a provocation. She didn't speak much, but when she did, the room fell silent. Because here was living proof that everything Athens theorized about, the balance between divine and human, reason and emotion, was standing right in front of them, perfectly composed. She made men question their faith not in the gods but in themselves. Because how do you claim to love wisdom when you can't even love the truth that stands before you? Let's take one last breath here. The philosophers of Athens spent their lives chasing immortality through words. Phryne achieved it by understanding something simpler, that the body is just another kind of philosophy, one written in skin instead of ink. Her story didn't end in a temple or a courtroom this time. It ended in conversation, whispered, argued, retold. The courtesan who'd once been accused of blasphemy became a paradox that haunted philosophy itself. Was she divine? Was she dangerous? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she existed, unapologetically, as the question they could never answer. And maybe that's her greatest legacy, not beauty, not scandal, but the courage to embody what others only theorized. To live as proof that truth doesn't need permission. So the next time a philosopher tries to separate soul from flesh, just remember Phryne, the woman who blurred that line so completely that even reason had to bow to her. Perfection always comes with a bill, and the universe never accepts late payments. For years, Phryne had defied time, law, and logic itself, existing somewhere between goddess and ghost. But even marble cracks, even myths grow tired. And Athens, for all its philosophy, loved a downfall almost as much as it loved a spectacle. Phryne was now a legend in her own lifetime. Her name traveled farther than any army. Her beauty was painted, sculpted, sung, and gossiped about from Egypt to Ephesus. But fame, real fame, is a slow poison. It turns every admirer into a potential thief, every friend into a shadow. The same eyes that once worshipped her began to scrutinize. How could anyone remain that beautiful for that long? Was she still divine, or merely preserved by deceit? The Greeks, obsessed with the symmetry of everything, couldn't stomach the asymmetry of aging, especially not in their living goddess. Let's picture her now, a few years removed from her trial, walking through the Athenian agora. The market hums as always, but the gazes have changed. Once they followed her in awe. Now they linger just a second too long, curious, skeptical, cruel. The lines around her eyes, the fading glow, tiny imperfections magnified into scandal. The courtesan who once conquered shame now faced its quieter, meaner cousin, pity. And that's the thing about beauty. People worship it until it starts reminding them of mortality. Then they punish it for daring to fade. Phryne, of course, saw it coming. She'd spent her life studying human nature. She knew admiration was never loyalty, it was projection. People didn't love her. They loved what she represented. Their own fantasies, their own envy, their own proof that the gods might still exist among them. And when that illusion faltered, they turned on her like betrayed disciples. Let's take a breath. It's a cruel paradox. The world demands beauty, but punishes the beautiful for aging. The body becomes both the temple and the crime scene. But Phryne didn't fight it. She didn't cling to her youth like a drowning queen. She pivoted the way only a woman who's survived public crucifixion can. She used her wealth, her wit, and her influence to transform herself from spectacle into patron. Artists who once sculpted her now worked under her. She bought vineyards, estates, even temples. While others chased immortality in rumor, Phryne invested in marble and memory. Yet even in her comfort, she must have felt it, the quiet ache of irrelevance creeping at the edges. The young courtesans whispered her name like a myth, not a rival. Men she'd once bewitched now spoke of her in past tense. She was magnificent, past tense. 2 words deadlier than any accusation. And still, Athens couldn't let her go. Statues of Aphrodite modeled after her stood untouched in the temples, mocking time itself. Visitors from distant cities came to see them, to see her even if she wasn't there. It was both flattering and cruel, because every compliment to the marble was a reminder that the woman was vanishing. Let's slow that down. Imagine being immortalized in stone, only to realize the stone version of you has become more real than you are. People bow to your likeness while ignoring your existence. They light incense before your image but cross the street to avoid your shadow. That's not worship. That's burial with applause. Phryne, to her credit, never played the tragic figure. She didn't beg for relevance. She observed, smiled that same enigmatic smile, and adapted once again. Rumors spread that she'd begun mentoring young women, not how to charm men but how to survive them. A new kind of legacy, quiet and subversive. Some said she taught them the art of power through poise, of silence as rebellion. Others whispered she'd gone full priestess, building her own cult of Aphrodite where beauty wasn't sin but scripture. Whether any of that's true doesn't matter. The point is that Phryne Smith was still working overtime. Even her twilight became a lesson. How to age without surrendering. But let's not pretend this was a gentle ending. Athens is merciless to those who remind it of decay. The same poets who once wrote odes to her began to romanticize her former beauty. Because nothing flatters the living like pretending they're already dead. The marble Aphrodites remained flawless. The mortal Phryne became a cautionary tale. Still, her ghost lingered in every sculpture, every painting, every whispered argument about the divine feminine. Because she'd done something the philosophers couldn't. She'd made the impermanent permanent. Her face, her story, her defiance. Frozen forever in stone and scandal. Let's reflect a moment. Maybe perfection isn't meant to last. Maybe it's meant to haunt. Phryne's tragedy, if you can call it that, wasn't that she aged, but that she endured in a world that couldn't comprehend a beautiful woman beyond her prime. When she finally withdrew from public life, it wasn't exile. It was evolution. History doesn't record her death, fittingly because mythic figures don't get funerals. They just fade into stories, and those stories grow teeth. And centuries later, when people stood in front of those marble goddesses, they didn't see a sculptor's hand. They saw her, the woman who dared to use the very thing that condemned her, her beauty, as her weapon, her currency, and her monument. The priests might have prayed to Aphrodite, but deep down they were worshipping Phryne. Let that irony sit for a second, because that's the price of perfection. It outlives you, but only by devouring you first. And Phryne, she paid in full. For every name carved in marble, 1,000 more are buried in dust. And for a while, Phryne was one of them, vanished from memory, swallowed by the centuries she once defied. The courtesan who outwitted Athens, who weaponized beauty and mocked shame, slowly dissolved into rumor. Statues cracked, poets died, and time, that most relentless editor, trimmed her story down to footnotes. It's poetic, really. The woman who'd once turned herself into a legend was now the ghost of a ghost. Her name mispronounced by scholars, misquoted by priests, and misused by moralists. History, as usual, had chosen its heroes, and Phryne didn't fit the syllabus. She wasn't a martyr, a philosopher, or a saint. She was inconvenient, too beautiful for pity, too clever for tragedy, too female for reverence. So the world forgot her. But here's the thing about myths. They're like seeds. You can bury them, burn them, rewrite them, and centuries later, they still sprout through the cracks. Phryne's resurrection began quietly. During the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered Greek art and decided marble bodies were classical instead of sinful, artists stumbled upon her name, and suddenly, this half-mythical courtesan, who once stood trial naked, became the muse of a new generation obsessed with rediscovering beauty. Painters, poets, sculptors, they all tried to reimagine her. Some turned her into a victim of male vanity. Others made her the embodiment of divine rebellion. Jean-Léon Gérôme painted her in 1861, standing before a crowd of judges, her robe falling away, that same frozen moment of defiance. The painting was called Phryne before the Areopagus, and when it debuted in Paris, the audience gasped, not just at the nudity, but at the power. Because even in paint, centuries later, Phryne still commanded the room. Let's pause there, really think about that. A story that began in a dusty Athenian courtroom, told by men who wanted to shame her, ended up inspiring an entire art movement celebrating her. The irony would have made her grin, but her revival wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. As the centuries rolled on, she became a kind of mirror for every generation's fears and fantasies. The Victorians saw her as a cautionary tale, beauty punished by morality. The Romantics saw her as liberation incarnate. Feminist writers in the 20th century saw her as the prototype of female agency, a woman who took control of her image long before women were allowed to have one. Everyone wanted a piece of Phryne, and maybe that's fitting because that's exactly what she understood best. That the more people talk about you, the less they can own you. Every retelling became a negotiation between sin and sanctity, between power and vulnerability. But what's fascinating is how history kept trying and failing to decide what she meant. Was she a manipulator or a masterpiece? A narcissist or a revolutionary? A mirror or a weapon? The truth, of course, is that she was all of them, and none of them. She was just a woman who refused to live politely inside someone else's definition. Still, as her story resurfaced, something remarkable happened. She began to feel modern. The more time passed, the more Phryne's defiance made sense. In a world obsessed with beauty, image, and reputation, where fame could make or break you, her story wasn't ancient at all. It was prophetic. Let's take a breath and think about that. Every generation thinks it invented performance, that we're the first to cure it, to brand, to pose. But Phryne was doing influencer strategy in the 4th century BCE. Every statue, every whisper, every carefully timed appearance was her version of a post, a headline, a viral stunt. Except hers were carved in marble instead of pixels. And just like today, people adored her for it until they didn't. Then they punished her for playing the game too well. History always repeats itself, just with better lighting. By the 19th century, Phryne Smith was everywhere again. Writers romanticized her, feminists reclaimed her, moralists condemned her. She became a cultural Rorschach test. Everyone saw what they wanted. To the artists, she was beauty's martyr. To the scholars, she was evidence that art and sin were inseparable. To the moralists, she was proof that divine punishment might be delayed, but never denied. And yet, underneath all that projection, one truth remained untouchable. Phryne had won. She'd outlived her accusers, outlasted her critics, and outshone the gods themselves. All because she understood that stories are stronger than laws. Still, her resurrection brought something unexpected. Empathy. People began to see not just the legend, but the loneliness beneath it. The girl from Thespes, poor, ambitious, clever, who built herself into a myth to survive. For the first time, she wasn't just the courtesan who stripped to win a trial. She was the woman who turned vulnerability into sovereignty. That's what modern audiences connected to. The performance wasn't vanity, it was survival. In a society that measured women by silence, Phryne made noise without speaking. In a world that punished confidence, she weaponized it. Let's breathe that in because it's still relevant. How often does the world still decide a woman's worth by her image? How often are confidence and audacity mistaken for arrogance? Phryne may have lived 2,000 years ago, but the trial hasn't really ended. Has it? Even now, when her story appears in documentaries, essays, and art retrospectives, the same arguments return, about decency, desire, and who gets to define either. But that's the beauty of it. Phryne doesn't give you an answer. She gives you a mirror. And the reflection, as always, says more about the viewer than the subject. In the end, Phryne's greatest trick wasn't escaping judgment. It was making sure judgment never stopped talking about her. She didn't defeat shame. She domesticated it. She made the system that tried to destroy her carry her name for eternity. Forgotten once, found again, and never fully understood. That's how you know a myth still works. Because Phryne didn't want to be remembered as perfect. She wanted to be remembered as impossible. If Phryne lived today, she wouldn't walk into a courtroom. She'd walk into a comment section. The marble pillars would be replaced by LED screens, the jurors by profile pictures, and her robe by the thin veil of the algorithm. And just like ancient Athens, the crowd would be ready not to listen but to judge. 'Cause really, what's changed? The amphitheater of public opinion just got Wi-Fi. Phryne's trial never ended. It just moved online. Every day, modern Phrynes, influencers, models, actors, anyone who dares to exist visibly and unapologetically, stand before digital Areopagi. Their crime? Being seen. Too much beauty, too much confidence, too much audacity. The charges haven't evolved since 4th century Greece. Only the hashtags have. Scroll through social media and you'll see it. The same moral theater. Admiration masquerading as outrage. Obsession pretending to be disgust. Commenters invoking decency, like priests performing an ancient ritual. A viral photo becomes a public trial. A caption becomes an indictment. And beneath it all, the same question Athens once asked. How dare she? Let's pause here. Let that irony wash over you. 2,300 years later, and humanity's favorite pastime is still policing the divine feminine. The only difference? Now it's happening in HD. When Phryne revealed herself before the court, she controlled the narrative. Today's Phrynes rarely get that chance. Their revelations, intentional or not, are captured, reposted, dissected by millions. One slip, one misunderstood post, and the mob assembles. Everyone wants to play judge. No one wants to admit they're really there for the entertainment. The platforms change, but the ritual remains the same: worship, condemn, repeat. Phryne's ancient jurors clutched their moral pearls. Today's trolls clutch their phones. The crowd still demands contrition, still decides who gets redemption, still pretends its cruelty is righteousness. It's the same theater of shame, just with worse lighting. And yet, Phryne would have thrived in this world. You can almost picture her Instagram, black and white portraits with captions like, "Divinity is in the eye of the beholder," hashtags dripping with irony. She'd weaponize the outrage, turn scandal into engagement, and end every controversy by selling a limited edition perfume called impiety. She would understand what most people still don't. Attention is currency, and those who can manipulate it survive it. But for every Phryne who masters the art of performance, there are countless others crushed by it. Because the trial never ends. It just refreshes every morning with a new defendant. Yesterday it was a pop star's outfit. Today it's a model's post. Tomorrow it's some poor soul who smiled wrong in public. The court of morality still demands daily sacrifices, and its God is still hypocrisy. Let's slow down for a breath. Why do we do this? Why do people, centuries apart, repeat the same ritual, admire, then destroy? Maybe because we're terrified of freedom, of people who live without apology. Phryne didn't scare Athens because she was beautiful. She scared them because she owned it. She made them confront their own contradictions. And that, even in the age of enlightenment and broadband, still makes people deeply uncomfortable. The truth is, we haven't progressed as much as we'd like to think. We still blur the line between admiration and punishment. We still mistake self-possession for arrogance. We still crucify confidence and canonize guilt. Every viral controversy, every online trial, is a rerun of Phryne's day in court. The same gasps, the same moral panic, the same fascination disguised as judgment. And just like then, the gods or the algorithms feed on it. But occasionally, amid the noise, a few modern Phrynes turn the script upside down. They reclaim the narrative, turn shame into spectacle, and, in doing so, expose the hypocrisy beneath it. They understand what Phryne did. You can't win by hiding. You win by refusing to be embarrassed. Let's imagine her watching all this from somewhere. Not heaven, not hell, just that smug place where history's best troublemakers go. She'd see these women, unapologetic, complex, imperfect, and smile knowingly, because the tools may have changed, but the strategy remains timeless. Turn the gaze into a mirror. Make the audience see themselves. Think about that the next time a headline screams, "Scandal," the word used to mean sin. Now it just means someone lived loudly. Phryne would have understood this game instinctively. She knew beauty wasn't power, perception was. That the crowd didn't want truth. It wanted distraction. That morality, when weaponized, was just envy wearing a halo. Let's take one last reflective pause. Humanity has spent thousands of years building laws, democracies, and philosophies to distance itself from its primitive instincts. Yet the second a woman dares to exist outside the script, we revert. Spears, tweets, doesn't matter. The mob is eternal, but so is defiance. And maybe that's why her story still matters. Because every time someone stands up or posts and refuses to apologize for who they are, they echo that same silent defiance in the courtroom of Athens. They remind the world that shame only works when you agree to feel it. Phryne taught us that truth and performance aren't opposites. They're survival tools. The trick isn't to escape the gaze. It's to own it. So yes, the trial never ends. The judges just keep changing usernames. There's an art to not apologizing, and Phryne invented it centuries before self-help books or TED Talks tried to explain it. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't denial. It was understanding that in a world addicted to moral theater, the most radical act is to walk off stage before they hand you the script. After her trial, after the marble, after the myths, Phryne didn't go around insisting she was misunderstood. She didn't issue a manifesto about feminine power or divine justice. She just lived. That was her rebellion. She didn't owe Athens an explanation, and that infuriated them even more than her nudity ever did. Because nothing enrages a society built on shame more than someone who refuses to play along. Let's sit with that. Most people spend their lives performing contrition, shrinking themselves to fit inside the acceptable version of who they're supposed to be. Phryne never learned that dance. She didn't beg for forgiveness because she'd never believed she'd done anything wrong. She understood that apology, when demanded by hypocrisy, isn't virtue, it's submission. And that's why she remained untouchable. Athens, for all its culture and intelligence, ran on performance. Everyone was pretending, the politicians pretending to be noble, the philosophers pretending to be objective, the priests pretending to be pure. Phryne saw through all of it. When she walked into a room, she didn't pretend. And that terrified them. Imagine her now, older, sitting in her courtyard surrounded by marble statues. Some of gods, some of herself, the difference barely noticeable. A soft breeze carries the scent of olive oil and dust. A student asks her how she survived everything, the trial, the jealousy, the judgment. She smiles. By not asking permission. That was her secret. Not charm, not beauty, boundaries. She decided early on that the only people who could define her were the ones who'd earned the right, and no one in Athens had. Let's pause here, because this is where Phryne's story starts to transcend history. Her defiance isn't just ancient gossip, it's philosophy. The art of being unapologetic isn't about arrogance, it's about alignment. Knowing who you are so completely that no accusation can shake it. Modern culture loves to market confidence as something you buy, something you wear. Phryne embodied the quieter, more dangerous version, conviction. She didn't scream empowerment. She didn't have to. Her existence was the argument, and you can feel it in every story about her. She never protested her innocence. She never defended her choices. She simply was and let everyone else sort out their discomfort. That's the secret the powerful rarely share. Control doesn't come from convincing others. It comes from refusing to need their approval. Let's take a breath. Picture the Athens she left behind. The judges who'd freed her still justifying their decision to their wives. The philosophers still debating whether beauty corrupts reason. The artists still chasing her image, trying to recreate what they could never possess. And then there's Phryne, free, wealthy, untouchable, quietly rewriting the rules without ever announcing she'd done it. That's the brilliance of being unapologetic. It's quiet, not loud. It doesn't beg for validation. It simply refuses erasure. But make no mistake, this wasn't easy. To live unapologetically means accepting solitude. Power isolates. Freedom terrifies the controlled. Phryne would have known that deeply. The same society that once worshipped her would never truly accept her. Yet she kept her composure, not out of arrogance, but clarity. You can almost hear her thoughts echoing across the centuries. They fear me because I remind them what freedom looks like. Let that line linger for a second. Because every era has its Phrynes, people who refuse to apologize for being visible, for taking up space, for simply existing outside the moral algorithm. And every era tries to drag them back into the box labeled acceptable. Athens tried it with accusations. The Renaissance tried it with morality. The internet tries it with comments. The method changes, the impulse doesn't. But Phryne's lesson endures. If you want to stay free, stop trying to be forgiven. There's something soothing about that idea, isn't there? The quiet defiance of self-acceptance. The peace of saying, I don't need your permission to be real. She didn't preach self-love. She didn't invent slogans. She embodied equilibrium, the kind that comes from no longer mistaking judgment for truth. Let's slow down for a reflective moment. Imagine her, years later, watching the sunset over the Aegean. The same waters that once mirrored her as she walked into the sea pretending to be Aphrodite. The city that condemned her now whispers her name in reverence. The same gods who were used to threaten her now wear her face in their temples. No apology, no revenge speech, just the slow, satisfying hum of poetic justice. She probably didn't call it empowerment. She called it Tuesday. That's the art of being unapologetic. You don't announce it. You just are. So maybe that's her real immortality. Not the statues, not the scandal, but the stillness of self she carried through it all. The refusal to let anyone else decide what her story meant. Athens gave her a trial. She gave herself peace. And in the end, that's all anyone's really searching for, the quiet confidence to live without permission, to stop performing for approval, to simply exist and mean it. So next time you hear someone described as too much, too bold, too proud, too visible, remember Phryne. Remember that she heard the same accusations and answered them with silence. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest no the world will ever hear. Centuries pass, empires rise and fall, libraries burn, languages vanish, and yet, somewhere between myth and archaeology, Phryne refuses to disappear. Her story lingers, like perfume on a vanished goddess, faint but undeniable. The dust of history has buried thousands of names more powerful than hers. But Phryne, she keeps resurfacing. It's poetic justice, really. The woman accused of impiety is now worshipped in museums. The same civilization that once tried to erase her ended up chiseling her likeness into eternity. Marble doesn't blush. Marble doesn't age. Marble never apologizes. And there she is, frozen in perfection, eyes half closed, that quiet smirk carved in stone as if she knows something her sculptors never would. Walk into any classical gallery today, Rome, Paris, Athens, London, and you'll see her everywhere, even when she's unnamed. Aphrodite rising from the sea. Phryne, the serene smile of a goddess accepting worship. Phryne, the curve of a statue that makes time feel irrelevant. Still her. She's become an echo in art, haunting every ideal of beauty that followed. But here's the irony. No one can quite agree what she really looked like. The statues modeled after her, idealized, stylized, perfected, tell us nothing about the woman herself. Her skin, her voice, her laugh, her flaws, all erased in favor of divine geometry. It's strange, isn't it? To be remembered so vividly and yet not at all. Let's pause for a moment. This is where myth meets melancholy. Every artist who sculpted her image kept her alive, but also made her less real. Phryne didn't survive as a person. She survived as an idea, a shape carved into time. And maybe that's the price of immortality. You get to live forever, but never as yourself. Still, there's a kind of beauty in that contradiction. She became what Athens worshipped most, form without flaw. But the truth is, what made Phryne unforgettable wasn't her perfection. It was her defiance, her ability to stand unashamed in a world built on shame. No chisel could capture that. No marble could hold it. Dust gathers on the ruins of temples. Statues crumble. And yet, when people gaze at them centuries later, there's always that flicker, that quiet hum of something familiar. They don't know her story, but they feel it. The resilience, the irony, the audacity. Somewhere, deep in the marble silence, Phryne is still laughing, because she knew beauty fades, flesh withers, but the story of rebellion against hypocrisy? That's eternal. Let's take a slow breath here. Imagine the archaeologist who unearths a fragment of her likeness, brushing away centuries of soil. They don't just find a face. They find a question. Why did this woman matter so much that her image was carved into eternity? And why did her name nearly vanish while her form survived? That's the tragedy of art. It preserves what we want to remember, not what we need to. Still, Phryne wins in the end, because the story always finds a way back. Every generation rediscovers her, not as a saint, not as a sinner, but as a mirror. She keeps reminding us that morality is theater, beauty is rebellion, and truth often hides behind a well-timed smirk. The dust of time can't smother that. You can almost hear her voice, soft, teasing, eternal. You can bury me, but I'll make your marble blush. It's funny, archaeologists catalog her likeness as unknown goddess. Historians file her under controversial figure, and artists keep redrawing her face without realizing they're all participating in her oldest trick, letting others define her while she remains undefinable. Let that sink in. Phryne's final act wasn't surviving her trial. It was surviving definition itself. She became an archetype, the immortal paradox. Purity and provocation, sin and sanctity, art and flesh. Every era remakes her because every era needs her. The Romans turned her into Venus. The Renaissance turned her into an ideal. The Victorians turned her into a warning. And now, the digital age is turning her into a meme, a metaphor, a reclaimed icon. Each version gets it wrong. Each version keeps her alive. Because immortality isn't about permanence, it's about repetition. Let's slow down again, breathe, and picture her statues. Some missing arms, some faceless, some little more than fragments of hips and torsos gleaming under museum lights. Tourists walk by, snap photos, whisper admiration. And for a brief moment, in that act of looking, they're part of her ritual, the same ritual that's been happening since the day she stepped out of her robe in that Athenian court. They gaze, they judge, they admire, they wonder, and without realizing it, they're continuing her story. Phryne, the courtesan from Thespe, the muse, the blasphemer, the survivor, still commands attention 2 millennia later. Not because she was perfect, but because she never pretended to be. That's her real immortality. Not marble, not myth, but memory that refuses to stay quiet. So the next time you stand in front of some cracked, ancient statue and feel that strange pull, that eerie sense of presence, maybe it's her. Maybe it's that same laughter echoing across time, whispering from the marble dust. Still looking? Picture this. The ruins of Greece under a blood-orange sunset. The Parthenon stands like a half-remembered poem, chipped and tired, but still pretending it owns the skyline. Tourists shuffle past, snapping selfies, not realizing they're standing on the bones of hypocrisy. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the wind, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it, the faint sound of laughter. Low, confident, timeless. Phryne's laughter, because she won. She always wins. 2,000 years later, The men who condemned her are dust, their speeches forgotten, their names mispronounced. But Phryne? She's still here, in every statue, every argument about morality, every conversation that begins with, "Did you hear about that woman who—" She lives rent-free in humanity's collective conscience, forever challenging us to admit that our judgment is just envy with better posture. Let's be honest, we never stopped putting people on trial. We just built bigger courts. Global ones. The internet. The press. Public opinion. And every time someone gets dragged across social media, every time a celebrity is shamed for being too much, you can feel Phryne smirking somewhere in the background, swirling a metaphorical glass of ancient wine and saying, "Told you so." Her story isn't a tragedy. It's a prophecy that keeps coming true. Because no matter how modern we pretend to be, humanity still loves to watch the powerful fall. Especially when they're beautiful. Especially when they're women. It's the same theater, just with new costumes. The courtroom has Wi-Fi now. The jurors are anonymous. But the sentence is always the same: guilt by visibility. And yet, every so often, someone refuses to flinch. Someone dares to own their flaws, to exist too loudly, too freely. And in that defiance, they echo her, the woman who stripped away not just her robe, but the illusion that shame ever held power. Let's take a slow breath here. That's the lesson buried under all the marble and myth. Phryne's real legacy wasn't her beauty. It was her understanding of the spectacle, that humans are ruled not by truth, but by performance. And if the world insists on turning your life into a play, you might as well steal the spotlight. She learned early that the crowd doesn't want sincerity. It wants a story. So she gave them one so magnificent they're still telling it 2,000 years later. Think about that for a second. The philosophers, forgotten. The politicians, gone. The laws, obsolete. But one naked woman, standing silent in a courtroom, outlasted them all. Now tell me, who really held the power? The funny thing about history is that it always tries to tidy itself up. It paints morality in neat lines, makes saints out of some and sinners out of others. But Phryne defied categorization. She refused to fit. And that's exactly why she lasted. The people who get remembered are never the ones who behave. They're the ones who break the script so loudly that time itself can't stop replaying the scene. And Phryne's scene, that moment of silence, of defiance, of perfect composure, is still echoing. You can feel it in art galleries, in feminist essays, in tabloid scandals, even in the rhythm of every woman who walks into a room knowing the world will stare and deciding not to care. The echo is there. It's in the shrug, the smirk, the refusal to bow. Somewhere in history's great audience, Phryne is watching, amused. Not out of vanity, but recognition. Because she knows how this story always goes. The rise, the scandal, the trial, the silence, the survival. It's the oldest narrative there is. And yet, here's the quiet brilliance of her victory. She didn't just survive the system. She exposed it. By turning shame into theater, she showed that the people who judge are never as moral as they pretend. She made their hypocrisy visible. And once you see the strings, you can't unsee the puppet show. Let's slow down. Picture the moment after her acquittal. The air thick with relief and disbelief. Phryne walking away from the courtroom, the sun washing her in gold. Behind her, the same men who condemned her are suddenly worshiping her again, whispering excuses to themselves. That image, that walk, became her eternity. It's not a victory march. It's a warning. Because Phryne didn't just mock Greek law, she mocked human nature itself. She knew that morality is cyclical, that shame always returns wearing a new disguise. But she also knew something deeper. Laughter breaks the cycle. When society expects repentance and you respond with a grin, you steal its script. When the world demands your shame and you give it art instead, that's rebellion in its purest form. And that's what her laughter means. It's not mockery. It's liberation. It's the sound of someone who figured out, long before the rest of us, that the only way to win the trial of public opinion is not to attend it. Let's end where we began. A courtroom, a robe, a gasp. The difference now is perspective. The crowd thought they were witnessing a fall from grace, but what they really saw was a woman ascending, out of their judgment, out of their reach into legend. Because Phryne didn't die. Not really. She became something more unsettling than divine. A permanent reminder. Every time we debate morality, every time art shocks the world, every time someone turns vulnerability into power, she's there, laughing softly through the centuries. So if you ever find yourself on trial, metaphorically or otherwise, for being too bold, too honest, too you, remember her. Remember the silence that turned into freedom. Remember the smirk that turned into immortality. And maybe, when the crowd starts shouting for shame, you'll hear that same laughter in the back of your mind. It's Phryne, whispering through the dust of ages. Let them look, I've already won. So next time someone tells you history is boring, remind them of the woman who walked into a courtroom naked and walked out immortal. If that doesn't make you hit subscribe, maybe you're just afraid of a little truth, or a little skin.